I see the recording symbol, so I'll try to keep my eye on that. Thank you for attending the Peel 2041 Plus Official Plan Review and Settlement Area Boundary Expansion Study public meeting. We're going to wait just a couple more minutes to let anyone else join, and then we'll commence the meeting. Okay, I think we can commence the meeting. Again, welcome to the Peel 2041 Plus Official Plan Review and Settlement Area Boundary Expansion Study. Settlement Area Boundary Expansion Study is shortened to SABE, and we'll use that term frequently throughout the evening. I'm Andrew Goodyear from SVN Architects and Planners, and I will be facilitating the meeting this evening. Focus of tonight's meeting is environment, climate change, and agriculture. And we have few technical studies that will be explored: scoped subwatershed study, climate change study, and agricultural impact assessment. We have a full agenda for the evening. We're going to commence with introductions and an explanation of how to use Zoom. Stefan from Hemsen will then present a summary of the SABE study and an overview of the environment, climate change, and agricultural technical studies that support the SABE study. This will be followed by a question and answer session with meeting participants, and finally concluding remarks. Please note that tonight's session will be recorded and posted on the region's website after the meeting in case anyone was unable to join or wishes to view it again. And we will be using Zoom's chat function as well, and everything in the chat will also be part of the public record. I will pass it to Tara and Adrian from the region to facilitate introductions.
Thank you, Andrew. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tara Bonpincero, and I'm an acting manager at the Region of Peel, and I've also been working on the Region Settlement Area Boundary Expansion Study. I'd like to welcome you to our session this evening, which is one of the Peel 2041 Plus Settlement Area Boundary Expansion Studies, where we're exploring the results of the technical studies. Before we begin this evening, it's appropriate to acknowledge the lands on which the Region of Peel operates, party of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. For thousands of years, Indigenous people inhabited and cared for this land. In particular, we acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabeg, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwe-Chippewa people, the land that is home to the Métis, and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who are direct descendants of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land, and by doing so, give our respect to its first inhabitants. This is the third of 4 sessions being held this week, and we're looking forward to sharing the results of the draft technical work on 3 studies this evening: the environmental screening report, part of the scope subwatershed study analysis, the agricultural impact report, and the climate change report focused on energy and emissions reduction. We're very interested in hearing your comments on the draft results of these studies. As we're all aware, Peel is one of the fastest growing areas in the province as well as in the country. We all know that the rapid growth is going to continue, with the province just recently releasing new 2051 growth of 2.28 million people for Peel by the year 2051. The settlement boundary expansion study is one component of the region's official plan review, which is being updated to ensure the region is well positioned to guide growth and development over the next 30 years in a responsible and sustainable way. We also find ourselves working to get your input in unusual times. In more normal times, we would be in a community center or a library, talking face-to-face with some boards and having some back and forth conversations. This evening, we will have to work together to share information and get your feedback in this new virtual world. We hope you'll be patient with us as we work through this new approach. Fortunately, as you'll hear tonight, there will be many more opportunities to provide your input on these studies. We anticipate finalizing the studies by the end of the year. So there will be links in the presentations where you will be able to provide comments or questions beyond just tonight. We do look forward to hearing your thoughts and hope that you will continue to be involved in our process. At this time, I would like to introduce a few people. On the call today is Stefan from Hemson Consulting, who will be giving the presentation. Andrew Goodyear is facilitating, and Blair Scorgie helping with the next agenda item on Zoom, are both from SVN Architects and Planners. From the region, Adrian Smith is on the line, Chief Planner and Acting Director, and he will be providing a few welcome remarks in a moment. Mark Head and Nahida Jamal, both managers at the region, are also on the call, available to help answer questions. In addition, we have a number of other regional staff from various technical divisions and departments across the region able to help respond to questions, and also staff from the local municipalities available to answer any questions that may come up on the local municipal projects. Thank you for your time tonight, and I will now pass it over to Adrian.
Great, thank you very much, Tara and Andrew, and welcome everybody to the session this evening. I am really looking forward to the discussion today, and I'm sure we'll be able to build on the sessions that we had last week on the overall Peel 2041 Plus official plan review and the sessions that we've already had earlier this week. As I've mentioned in the sessions earlier this week, the decision-making around settlement boundary expansion is really a fundamental part of our Peel official plan review and municipal comprehensive review. And the recent decision from the province to extend the planning horizon that Tara mentioned certainly has helped increase that importance as there's additional growth that we'll need to be planning for through this round of official plan review. And the input that we receive from all stakeholders, from the town, from landowners, from across the region and beyond, is critical to being successful in that settlement boundary planning work. Of course, the regional official plan policies are only really the start of planning for 2041 and 2051. We know that there's lots more work that's going to be required and lots of opportunity for input throughout those various stages of the planning process yet to unfold, including obviously the local official plan with the town, secondary planning, phasing and staging work, and environmental planning around the next phases of watershed planning, environmental impact studies, and all of the ongoing work that we'll be doing in efforts to address climate change in the planning work that's undertaken across the region. So with that, I'm going to thank everybody again for participating. I look forward to the discussion, and back to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I'm going to pass it briefly to Blair Scorgie, who's going to explain how to use Zoom, and will take us through a couple of introductory polling questions to get some information about you. Blair?
Thank you, Andrew. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. As Andrew mentioned, my name is Blair Scorgie, and I'm a senior planner with SVN Architects and Planners. And before we begin tonight's presentation, as Andrew mentioned, I would like to spend just a few minutes introducing you to the Zoom platform while providing you with an overview of how it will be used for the purposes of tonight's meeting. So for those of you who are joining us by computer, tablet, or smartphone and using the Zoom app specifically, you'll see near the bottom of your screen a chat icon. If you click on this icon, the chat window will open up. In my case, it opens up on the right-hand side of my screen. It's likely something very similar for you. Near the bottom of the chat window, you will see a box indicating where to type your message. So please type your questions in this box at any time throughout the course of the presentation. If you are joining us by telephone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9 to indicate that you have a question. To ensure we can cover all the material in a timely fashion this evening, and there's a lot of it to go through, We will be leaving our microphones muted throughout the course of the meeting. Questions will be held until the end of the presentation, following which my colleague Andrew will facilitate a question and answer period. Questions in the chat box will be read aloud by Andrew. If you're joining us by telephone and you have pressed *9, your microphone will be unmuted at the appropriate time, and either your name or the last digits of your phone number that pop up on our screen will be called, and you'll be asked to state your question at that time. In order to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to participate in tonight's meeting, we respectfully ask that you limit your questions to one at a time. Once everyone's first question has been addressed, we will then open the floor to additional questions. In addition to the question and answer period, participants who are joining us using the Zoom app, again, either on your computer, tablet, or smartphone, will have an opportunity to participate in this series of poll questions. At key points throughout the presentation, questions will be asked and a poll window will pop up opening on your screen. When this happens, please complete the polling exercise by clicking on the appropriate response. Upon completion of the polling exercise, results will be tabulated and shared with all participants. You'll notice also that many of our questions are single response questions. Yes, no, don't know. One of our questions is a multiple choice question where you can indicate multiple responses and check all of that apply. The findings from the polling exercise, as well as the feedback obtained throughout the question and answer period tonight, will be summarized in a consultation and engagement report, which will be shared on the dedicated project website in the weeks following this meeting. So without further ado, I think it's time to jump into our first polling question. So I'm going to launch the first poll. And this question is simply trying to get a sense of where everybody is joining us from tonight. So we want to know, where do you live? Are you joining us from Brampton, Caledon, Mississauga, or outside the region of Peel? So we'll just give this a few seconds so everybody has a chance to respond. Okay, it looks like everybody who's going to respond has responded. So we'll end that and I will share the results. So you can see we've got 17% of people are coming from the city of Brampton, 25% from Caledon, 8% from Mississauga, and 50% from outside of the region. Okay, I'm going to ask one more polling question before I hand it back over and we start the presentation. So question number 2. What best describes you as a participant today? Select all that apply. So this is a multiple choice response. You can tick off multiple boxes and just click submit when we've checked off all the applicable boxes and you're ready to submit your response. So again, we'll give this a few seconds so people can spend a little bit of time filling it out. Okay, we'll give it about 10 more seconds. Okay, it doesn't look like we're seeing any new results. So I will close that poll, share the results. So as you can see, 27% of us are local residents, 9% of us are business owners, 18% are members of the development or building industry, 27% are members of local municipal governments or partnering agencies, and 27% indicated other. So that's it for the polling for the time being. I'm going to hand it back over to Andrew.
Thanks, Blair. We're now going to commence the presentation, which will be delivered by Stefan from Hempson. Just a reminder that all questions will be addressed following the presentation, but please feel free to enter your questions in the chat part anytime throughout the presentation. And if you phoned in, you can raise your hand using *9 and we'll ask you to state your question at the end. I'll pass it to Stefan.
Thank you, Andrew. My name is Stefan Chetrunovich. I work for Hempson Consulting in Toronto. I'm on the consulting team that's assisting the region with this settlement area boundary expansion study. There'll be a few more polling questions interspersed throughout some of these slides. Just to reassure you that these are not intended to be scientific polls, and they certainly won't be used to determine where new urban lands are going to be located. Their purpose is solely to assist us, the consulting team, in the questions and answer session that's going to follow this. And I think it's fair to say that we've been encouraged by the poll results so far with the sessions earlier in the week. So hopefully we can continue with that success tonight. The focus of the next 30 minutes will be the latest findings of the SABE study. And I'm going to spend a few minutes initially on how this study fits into the region's broader official plan review. And again, for those of you who've sat in on last week's sessions on the official plan that Adrian referred to, as well as the SABE sessions earlier this week, a big thank you in advance for your patience as we repeat the same script over and over again. And as I say, our main focus today will be the results of some of the background technical work, which was released at the beginning of the summer, and which will guide decisions about where best to designate new urban lands in southern Caledon. And that technical work that's the focus of this evening are shown in the title on the introductory slide. So we can just move to the next slide. As Tara mentioned, the SABE study is just one of many being undertaken as part of the region's official plan review. The official plan itself is an important document. It guides, among many other things, how growth is managed and how services are delivered in Peel. It does, of course, need periodic updating to ensure that it reflects the evolving needs of Peel communities, provincial priorities, and of course, the ever-changing pattern of development in the region. And so the recent official plan update started in 2013, and it will be completed in 2022. The official plan review has recently been rebranded from Peel 2041 to Peel 2041 Plus because, as Adrian and Tara mentioned, the time horizon for growth planning, which the region is required to follow, was recently extended to 2051 under the Provincial Growth Plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. I'll speak to more of these changes, including the growth plan changes, in a minute. But if we could just go to the next slide, you'll see there on the graphic here, you can see that the settlement area boundary expansion study, although it's a very important one, is just one of the many focus areas that make up the Peel 2041 work. Work in other focus areas are in various stages of development and draft policies for many of these focus areas, including the growth management one and the climate change and wildland fires one were presented in last week's public sessions. So if you'd like to know more about Peel 2041 Plus, there's an excellent introductory video on the region's official plan review webpage, and I'd encourage you to go and view that. But our focus tonight, as I said, will be on the SABE work. And the SABE study is really driven by the reality that Peel region, which is already one of the fastest growing places in Southern Ontario, will continue to grow rapidly in the coming decades. So there's a few figures on the screen here for you. As I mentioned, the regional official plan must conform to the growth plan, which is the provincial plan which manages growth in the Greater Toronto Area and the City of Hamilton, and an outer ring of municipalities that surround the GTA. And in late August, Schedule 3 to that growth plan was amended to extend the time horizon for growth planning from 2041 to 2051. And the amendment also now requires the region to achieve 2.3 million people by 2051 and 1.1 million jobs. And this represents more than 300,000 more people and almost 100,000 more jobs than what we were previously planning for to 2041. And indeed, the previous 2041 targets represent about 40% more people and jobs than were in Peel at the time of the last census taken in 2016. This is, by any measure, very rapid growth that the region must plan for over the next 30 years. Now, no doubt much of that growth can be accommodated in existing urban areas as intensification, mostly in the cities of Mississauga and Brampton, and generally close to major transit station areas and downtown areas. However, work that's being undertaken as part of the growth management focus area, which I mentioned a couple of slides ago, clearly demonstrates that new urban land will be required to achieve these population and employment targets to 2051. And that urban land will have to be in Caledon. There simply isn't any space left in the other two cities to the south. And so the main purpose of the SABE study is to determine the best location for those additional lands, both lands for new community uses, which would be focused around residential development, as well as lands for the more exclusive use of economic activities, i.e. employment lands. We've approached the SABE study by conducting a thorough evidence-based review of a focus study area, which is located in southern Caledon, within agricultural lands that are often referred to as the White Belt. 12 technical studies have been undertaken on this area to provide decision makers with information about the characteristics of the land in the focus study area and its suitability for urban expansion. The studies cover a whole range of topics, from the amount of growth that might occur to the form and location of development that might be needed to accommodate the growth, to the demands on services that the growth might generate, services like parks and rec facilities, libraries, roads, transit, water and wastewater systems. And certainly each study is an important piece of the SABE puzzle. However, we recognize that some studies, particularly those whose results depend on the location of development within the FSA, will likely be more determinative than others when delineating the SABE boundaries. And that's certainly true, perhaps, of some of the studies we're going to be looking at tonight. We hope that this week's sessions will allow you to weigh in on which study results you think are important for us to consider as we move to the next phase of the work. So collectively, the detailed, the technical studies, whether they are determinative or not about the SABE lands, will help guide the future planning of the SABE area. Particularly in the subsequent master servicing plans and the secondary plans that the town of Caledon will be undertaking in the coming years. And you can see from this slide how the SABE work sets the overall framework and strategic direction for the local planning that's going to come later, and the land use regulations like zoning and site plan requirements that are all needed for making decisions about development applications. All of this more detailed planning will come much later, well after the new official plan has been approved. A couple of other final things about the studies. They were posted on the region's SABE project webpage back in June, together with a comprehensive summary document. The findings of the studies were presented to council that month. And secondly, we want to emphasize that the studies are still in draft, and this is one of many consultations which we're holding on the studies, and we plan to use the feedback that we receive to finalize the studies, and our target to do that is the end of this year. This slide here shows you a map of the focus study area. It's set out in pink. The area was delineated based on criteria developed through a workshop held with local municipal and regional staff and agencies, and it was released for public consultation just before the COVID lockdown, in fact, in the first week of March. And you can see that the FSA covers almost all of the white belt lands in southern Caledon. It excludes the provincial green belt to the north. You'll also see that it's quite a large area, and that was done deliberately, in part in order to ensure that we had sufficient land to accommodate additional growth that we knew was coming out of the growth plan amendment. And if you look at the right-hand corner of the map, in the legend, you'll see a blue box. This represents the approximate land requirement for the SABE to 2041, about 1,300 hectares of new land. And the current estimate is that for 2051, that blue box would need to be anywhere between 2 and 4 times as large as what's shown here. You'll also see that the FSA is somewhat framed by significant natural features, such as the large valley lands that run north-south to the west of Bolton, as well as the route of the GTA West Highway, which will likely be the most significant piece of infrastructure constructed in this part of the town. I should note that the highway route shown here is not the preferred route that was released in August by the province. However, the new route is only slightly different from the one that's shown on screen. The only major difference is that the highway interchange that is proposed for Bolton, so the sort of extreme eastern edge of the corridor that you see here, that interchange is slated now to be positioned slightly to the west. And that may have consequences for land use plans in that area, including the ROPA 30 lands, which are shown in the hatched yellow markings. Those lands are currently under appeal at the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal. And so then to the technical studies themselves, I'm just going to very briefly outline the methodologies that were used, the principles which guide them, and the general conclusions that have been reached. We've left lots of time at the end of this presentation to answer questions you might have and to have a more general discussion on these findings. There are 12 studies altogether. And for presentation purposes, we've organized them into 4 themes. The first theme covers the natural environment, including physical features, the climate and the impact of climate change, and the state of agriculture in the FSA. And this is the theme that's the focus of tonight's session. The second theme addresses the resources in the FSA, both the natural resources and the cultural and archaeological heritage that is present in the area. That we'll be dealing with tomorrow. The hard infrastructure requirements for the anticipated growth in the SABE, that is the water, the wastewater, and transportation infrastructure, are dealt with in the third theme. And given that this infrastructure will have a significant bearing on the financial impact of the urban expansion plans, the fiscal impact technical study is included under this theme. And this was the theme that was addressed in yesterday's session. And then finally, the session that we did on Monday dealt with growth management and the built environment theme, which looks at the spatial arrangement of community lands through the perspective of community health and public facility needs, as well as the distribution of lands for commercial and employment uses that might be required. If you missed the earlier sessions, as Andrew said, recordings of them will be posted on the region's SABE webpage. And so then to the general purpose and approach used by the studies. The agricultural impact assessment is being done in 2 phases. The first phase is a scoped analysis to assess the impact of the SABE on the agricultural system. And the second phase will be a more detailed assessment focused more on localized impacts and minimum distance separation requirements on the draft SABE area. The climate change study focuses on developing regional official plan policies that support efficient energy consumption in the SABE and ways to minimize greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, we have the environmental screening and scoped subwatershed study, whose main purpose is to ensure that natural heritage features and water resources, of which there are many in the FSA, are protected, restored, or otherwise improved when planning for the SABE lands. Each study's approach was tailored to the subject matter at hand, the availability of data, and the local conditions on the ground in the FSA. And so the approach for the agricultural impact assessment included a review of applicable policy and the regulatory framework under which these assessments are done, an analysis of the state of agricultural conditions and farm activity in the FSA, and as mentioned, an assessment of the potential impacts to the agricultural system if development were to occur in various areas of the FSA. The climate change study also involved a detailed review of applicable policies, provincial and municipal, and the regulatory environment. Energy and emissions case studies from municipalities across Ontario and nationwide were also reviewed to determine best practices in developing new regional policies. And finally, the environmental screening and scoped subwatershed study includes several strands of analysis, a policy and regulatory review, but also creating an inventory of environmental constraints and a screening out exercise to ensure those constraints are left out of the initial SABE areas. And then a more detailed analysis of the location of environmental features and the potential impact of different types of development on stormwater runoff, for example, is currently underway. A few final points about the climate change study. This study is just one of many initiatives that are being coordinated under the region's climate change policy review. And so there's quite a lot of overlap with work being prepared under other Peel 2041 plus focus areas, including, of course, the climate change and wildland fires focus areas. But there's also considerable overlap with some of the other SABE technical studies, to the extent that water resources and natural heritage protection is obviously a key feature of the scoped subwatershed study. And agricultural policies and analysis address food security and the agricultural system impacts, and sustainable transportation modes and the impact of transportation networks on the natural environment are certainly addressed through the transportation analysis. And then finally, community health, including how community lands can best be made compatible with the natural environment, are dealt with under the community health assessment. So really, to avoid duplication, this particular study is quite scoped, and it focuses on how planning for the SABE area can minimize greenhouse gas emissions and minimize energy consumption. So we're going to talk about agriculture now. The provincial growth plan requires that the feasibility of any urban expansion be assessed from an agricultural perspective, with the intent of minimizing impacts on the agricultural system. Provincial policies also include formula for ensuring that there is a minimum distance between urban lands and certain farm operations, particularly those with livestock. And these policies are all addressed through the agricultural impact assessment. I should say that even without the policy framework, this particular technical study would be particularly important for the SABE work because the vast majority of land in the FSA is agricultural land. And it also includes some livestock farms. And indeed, much of the agricultural land is of very high quality. This study, as I mentioned earlier, I think is being done in 2 phases. Phase 1 assesses what land in the FSA would minimize the impacts on agriculture if it was urbanized. And then once a draft SABE area is delineated, phase 2 will focus on those minimum distance separation formula requirements. The general principles which are applied in this analysis are shown on the screen here. The SABE should avoid lands with viable farms, especially where improvements and infrastructure investment has been made in recent years, and where there are active farms. Areas more suitable for urban expansion include where farm properties have been divided or are otherwise fragmented, where agricultural lands are already close to urban areas, and on lands that have a low agricultural quality. And what you see on the map on this slide is the approach that was used for this phase 1 analysis. The FSA was divided into 8 sub-areas, and each sub-area was then evaluated using land use surveys, consultation with local farmers and farm organizations, some field investigations, and there was also a process that was undertaken of identifying those properties that might be subject to those minimum distance separation formula. And so I'm just going to move from right to left here, and we'll just speak about Area 1, which is those northern fingers of land that extend to the north of the existing Bolton settlement area. Here, agriculture is alive and well, and the property fabric, the properties on which it operates are relatively intact. The majority of the land is under production, and there are very good connections to the agricultural system that extends to the west, to the north, and to the east in those greenbelt lands. Area 2 also has agriculture, but the property fabric is somewhat more fragmented, and the livestock sector, to the extent that it exists there, is generally declining. So this area lends itself perhaps certainly better than Area 1 for urban expansion. Area 3, which extends south from the rural settlement of Sandhill down to the proposed highway, is quite isolated from existing urban development, which is good for farming in the long term. And indeed, this area includes a number of active farming operations. Then we have Area 4 to the south, in between Tullamore and Bolton. Much of this area is farmed, but there is extensive non-farm property ownership. And there's a widespread pattern of farm fragmentation and a high incidence of potentially conflicting uses. So there's a lot in Area 4 that would impede the long-term viability of a lot of farming. In Area 5, we have a significant cluster of active farm operations up near the northwest area of Area 5, including some large livestock operations. Area 6, which is due north of Mayfield West, north of the highway. There is a number of non-farm residential uses scattered throughout this area, not the least of which is the Brampton Caledon Airport, which is in the hatched area shown. And there's also considerable non-farm ownership in this area as well, perhaps indicative of some land speculation and the expectation of urban expansion. In Area 7, in the southwest part of the FSA, the agricultural character is quite well established, and there's limited property fragmentation, which bodes well for long-term farming. And then Area 8, finally, is the area due north of Mayfield West and south of the highway. The existing land use here is largely agricultural, but the area has an extensive interface with Mayfield West, which is growing very rapidly and towards the north. I think we can skip past this slide, which is essentially what I just sort of set out, and go straight to our first polling question. Please remember that these are only being used to inform the Q&A to follow and give the team here a sense of whether you think we're communicating the information to you clearly and whether you think we're on the right track. So the question here is, do you generally agree with the agricultural principles to be considered when determining the location of the SABE? And you can answer yes, no, or don't know. And we've put those principles up on screen there if you want to quickly scan them. Okay, we'll just give a couple more seconds here. And I think, Blair, we can probably stop there. Over 80% generally agree with the approach we've taken. To don't know. So I mean, I would certainly urge those who said don't know, if you have a specific question, please type it into the chat box, and we'd be happy to address it at the end. Moving on then to the climate change study, I noted earlier that this particular study is focused on how the region can best plan the SABE so that greenhouse gas emissions and energy consumption are kept to a minimum. Transportation patterns and the form of buildings are the biggest factors influencing emissions. Those are two areas that are closely looked at in this study. And then the efficient use of land and municipal services play significant roles in minimizing energy consumption. As I mentioned earlier, this study draws on some of the excellent work being done by other municipal jurisdictions in Canada. For example, secondary planning in Toronto, which supports district energy systems. These systems are low carbon energy networks that distribute energy to buildings in very small geographic areas. This study also looked at voluntary construction standards in the city of Guelph. And these standards promote the construction of net zero emissions buildings. These are buildings that have, well, zero greenhouse gas emissions. And they're able to do that through a combination of energy efficiency gains and getting their energy supply from sustainable non-greenhouse gas emitting sources. The study also looked at case studies in Kitchener and in London, which are designing new greenfield communities to be near zero and ultimately over time transition to net zero emissions communities. And also focused on official plan policies in the city of Victoria and BC that support energy conservation and renewable energy initiatives. And the general principles that this study recommends that Council consider when selecting the SABE include really building on what already exists in Southern Caledon. Principally, the two major urban settlements that are growing very quickly, Bolton and Mayfield West, and also protecting sensitive environmental areas that play hugely important roles in capturing and storing atmospheric carbon dioxide, like the natural heritage system, which we'll get to in a minute. And so the principles are set out on screen here. Generally, the SABE, through the climate change lens, should be focused on lands that represent a contiguous expansion of those existing settlement areas, where infrastructure and services are already in place and planned for, where there are strong connections with existing settlement areas so that people can live and work and play in the same area, very much in line with the complete community concept that is promoted by the growth plan. areas that are close to existing or planned transit and active transportation infrastructure, and areas that ensure access or connections with planned energy infrastructure. And of course, areas that avoid natural areas that sequester carbon. And so to our second poll question, a similar one to the one before, do you agree generally with the energy and emissions reductions principles to be considered when determining the location of the SABE? Yes, no, or don't know. We'll just get a couple more seconds. And then we can stop there, I think. So again, similar results. You know, a fair number of the participants generally agreeing with these sorts of principles. Although one respondent saying perhaps not quite enough information to make a firm conclusion. And again, I would certainly welcome that individual to ask a detailed question related to that in the Q&A to follow. We'd be happy to see if we can clarify things. And so to the final study then. The growth plan understandably places great emphasis on protecting and enhancing natural heritage, hydrologic and landform systems when planning the SABE. And you'll remember from the map that the FSA has many important natural features within it, and it's also very close to the Greenbelt. So a very important technical study is this environmental screening and scoped sub-watershed study. This study is being undertaken by a team of environmental consultants led by Wood Environment and Infrastructure Solutions. Like the agricultural study, it's being undertaken in 2 phases. So phase 1 is an environmental screening, and that's been done. That's provided us with the general location of natural heritage and water resources features, natural hazards, and other areas that are subject to policy restrictions on development. And so this work has allowed us to very broadly map our no-go areas for development. And those are reflected in the map that you see. As I say, phase 1 has been completed in draft, and it's on the region's website. And the results of this screening study, as I say, have been incorporated into the FSA map. And you'll see on this slide how the Wood team, using mainly existing provincial and regional data layers, have categorized the environmental constraints in the FSA. So they identify high constraints, which are natural environment features and areas where development is prohibited under provincial policy. They also identify areas of which are referred to as moderate constraints, which are features and areas where there are indications that they may be high constraint areas, but some further assessment is required in order to confirm that. And then finally, they identify areas of low constraint, which are mapped natural environment areas that, based on our current state of knowledge, do not represent constraints to development. Although the caveat here, of course, is that they may still require some additional study or some kind of buffering or enhanced land management requirements at the local planning level. This map here sets out the constraints. And so this is a map of the whole of Caledon. And so the FSA is down near the bottom in that sort of the white belt area. The high constraints are set out in the pea green color, and you can see the sort of the fingers of valley lands that extend down through the FSA into Brampton. The moderate constraints are colored orange, and the low constrained areas are in yellow. And you can see there's a nice little zoomed satellite image here, which gives you a sense of what a high constraint looks like on the ground. And that's a valley land extending just to the west of Bolton and just north of Mayfield Road. The map on the following slide is the same map, but the zoomed satellite image here shows what a typical moderate constraint feature is. And so this particular moderate constraint appears just to the right of the high constraint creek, which runs sort of north-south. And it's a sort of a darker, if you look at the satellite image, it's a sort of a darker shade, somewhat just north of Mayfield Road and to the west of the other arterial road. I can't read the name here, but sort of a darker shade there. And then the following map gives you a sense of an area that is typical of an area that's covered with low constraints. So no constraints on development based on our current knowledge, of course. And that would be either side of the road, which is in fact the Huron-Ontario Highway 10, extending north from Old School Road. So either side of that highway are areas of low constraint right now. As I say, phase 1 of this work has been completed in draft. It's on the region's website. Phase 2, the scoped subwatershed study. This will give the region direction on how to protect and manage the environment. It will map out the natural heritage and water resource systems. And it will also identify the requirements for managing stormwater runoff. Phase 2 is underway right now, and it's set to be completed this fall. It will involve a combination of desktop data and field assessments. It will allow the phase 1 work to be further refined. And of course, it will set the stage for more detailed, smaller scale watershed studies that will be undertaken by the town as part of its secondary plan process. So then our final poll question, do you feel that the phase 1 environmental screening has appropriately identified the environmental constraints within the FSA? Yes, no, or don't know. And again, we'll just give you a couple more seconds. Okay, I think we can close that, Blair. Thank you very much. So again, around 80% in general agreement with the approach for the environmental screening, but 2 people certainly perhaps don't have quite enough information to make a definitive assessment of these particular findings. Okay, so we're going to move to the Q&A now. Just before we do that, just a quick summary. The principles and the general conclusions that have been presented here are really going to guide us in the next step of the SABE process. That next step is to delineate a preliminary SABE area for regional council to consider. But do remember that the SABE is really just the first step in the planning process for Southern Caledon. There's lots of detailed planning, zoning, and site planning to come after what is a very macro level and regional scale undertaking that is this SABE study. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to pass it over to Andrew now for questions. I'm happy to answer any questions, and we've got lots of subject matter experts on the line as well who can do the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steph. We have a few questions that have been asked, which I will go through now, and I will certainly encourage anybody to add their additional questions or any concerns they had about the principles, but we can get to that when we get through these first few questions. So we had a question with respect to the agricultural impact assessment, asking what does MDS mean? Mark answered the question in the chat. MDS stands for minimum distance separation, which is the setbacks, which refer to a setback buffer requirement that separates sensitive land uses from livestock farm operations to mitigate or reduce the potential of nuisance or impacts of odor. Settlement expansion that introduces urban uses is restricted within the MDS setback distances. So hopefully that answers that question, but if not, feel free to add an additional comment in the chat and we can address it. The next question is from Harry, and he asks, can you comment on the use of different sub-areas for different studies? Will the region's process assess one study's results for a sub-area with a similar but not identical sub-area of a different study, i.e. water, wastewater, and transportation, hard infrastructure sub-area for a location, but differently defined sub-area in the agricultural study? Steph, I'm not sure that may be a question for you, or if not, we can pass it to the region.
Yeah, I think I can have a crack at it. It's a very good question. And just some background to this, Harry. When the technical studies were first sort of conceived, I think the feeling was that we didn't want to impose a uniform methodology on them. As I stated in the presentation, each study kind of followed its own path because the availability of data was different depending on the study, and the local conditions on the ground are kind of different depending on how you're analyzing the land in the FSA. And certainly, you know, the policy requirements are very different too. So to the extent that some studies divided the FSA into sub-areas, we didn't prescribe what those areas were. And so you've got to go to the studies to find out the justification for why those areas are divided the way they are. But certainly, for example, on the water and wastewater side of things, generally the lines are drawn with reference to water pressure zones. The reason being that, you know, once you cross one of those zones, across one of those lines, there's quite significant infrastructure investment that has to be made in order to open up the next zone. So that's the sort of the thinking behind drawing the lines for that study. Transportation, those areas were drawn to ensure that each area had a connection to an existing settlement area. So you'll see the transportation areas are kind of clustered around Mayfield West and Bolton, but each one has direct access to an existing settlement area. So the idea that each area would be able to sort of connect to the existing transportation network if it was sort of switched on. And again, agriculture is a little bit different. I think it's fair to say, and Mark may want to comment on this, that there's no rocket science behind the agricultural areas. It was simply done to sort of try and come up for some reasonable basis for comparison, but there was certainly no policy direction that was being followed in order to divide the areas for the agricultural studies. But the reason for your question, I think, ultimately, is that what are we going to do when we have, you know, different areas and different studies and they're giving different results? And I'm going to give the answer I gave last night, which is to say that what we expect to happen when we first pull all this together is to try and triangulate everything. And what we hope is that when we do that, there will be clearly some areas that are more favored over others for urban expansion. And that will be across all of the studies. Now, some of the actual boundaries might be slightly different. And so when we get to, though I don't think we're going to have an issue in terms of where generally the SABE lands are going to be, when we actually sit down and draw the map, we may have to come to some sort of evaluation system to try and make decisions at the margins about, A, which study prevails over another if there's conflicts, and B, which sub-area boundary prevails over another. And there are lots of ways of doing that. So I hope that gives you some sense of where, how we're coming at this and how those sub-areas came to be.
Thanks, Steph. I have a question from Jen. Many properties within Caledon are naturally severed by high constraint natural heritage feature areas. For example, east of the Mayfield West area is low constraint, but there is a high constraint feature as shown on slide 22. Would the urban boundary follow strict property lines, or could it include lands to avoid those high constraint areas and naturally sever or cut through existing properties? I think that's an interesting question, and I believe Mark would be able to answer that.
Hi, and thanks for the question. So that is to come in next stages, but as we understand the natural heritage system planning requirements for the settlement area, when it comes time to setting the boundary, this study is going to inform that process. And depending on the type of high constraint that is present in the proposed area of the settlement expansion, we may very well, for example, along the Greenbelt fingers, stop the settlement boundary expansion at the Greenbelt edge. And that could form a logical boundary for a settlement expansion area within the FSA. The other options, though, we do have the, also we're looking at the total natural heritage system features and areas, as well as linkages and enhancement areas to consider as well through that study. And in many cases, as you see, there's a wide distribution of natural heritage system in the FSA, and portions of that will be brought inside of a settlement area boundary. So there's different choices, or it may be logical that we set the settlement boundary expansion at a logical edge, such as a property boundary or road concession. And then we'll decide on how to bring in elements of the natural heritage system. And in all cases, there will be policy direction to appropriately identify the natural heritage system for protection, and that policy direction will flow down to the local level planning at the town of Caledon. So there's a variety of approaches, and very much so the natural heritage system planning will be helping us inform where the settlement boundary expansion is located in the FSA, and help determine the configuration of the boundary of that expansion. And I'm happy to take any more questions that you have about that. Hopefully that's answered the question. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Mark. If you do have additional comments, anyone, please feel free to enter in the chat. We have a question from Stephen. What plans are there to develop the white lands surrounding the Etobicoke Creek? What responsibility does Caledon have for managing water runoff as these waters approach Brantland and flow through the bypass channel? So what would Greta Thunberg, the climate activist, do? Would she recommend continued development adding to global warming, or to reforest low constraint lands? I believe I can pass that to Mark again, and if not, we can find someone else from the region.
Yeah, happy to take that question. So we have developed a fairly detailed terms of reference for what Stefan described as is our scoped subwatershed study. There's a significant water resources component in that, and guided by the provincial policy direction and our own regional planning interests, we've also scoped a requirement to look at innovative approaches to managing water resources So there will be a requirement to identify, protect, improve, and restore a water resource system and manage stormwater. The study, and you'll see it progress throughout our SABE study process in more detail as we go, includes an impact assessment study stage. And that work does include an hydraulic analysis at a regional scale for the purpose of testing sensitivity of areas proposed for urban expansion. And that's going to look at upstream and downstream flooding impacts. And we are asking the technical consultant to provide very specific guidance on how to build in scenario planning for climate change. And a lot of that detail does require more detailed studies at the local level at the stage at which you are planning land uses for settlement expansion. But the regional scope study that we're undertaking at this stage very much has to and should and will be doing, providing that regional level analysis and policy direction for climate change considerations, because we do know that there's a potential for downstream impacts and they need to be managed. So that is built into our study. And back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Mark. That's all the questions we have at the moment, but we certainly encourage anybody to ask an additional question, to comment on perhaps the study principles or findings. I can ask a couple of questions here. We'd also be interested in hearing your thoughts on, do you have any questions or comments on the overall settlement area boundary expansion study? Do you perhaps have any local knowledge that we should be aware of in the study area that may impact or inform technical studies? And were you surprised by any of the outcomes of the draft technical studies? So any of that or anything else you have, we'd be happy to hear it. We can have another about 20 minutes for the meeting. So we're happy to stay on and take any more comments or questions. And if someone has something that may be a little bit complex or they're having challenges typing it in, we can certainly consider unmuting you. You can ask your question that way or make a comment if that would be easier for you. You can let us know in the chat.
I'm wondering, Andrew, if I can follow up with a question from Mark.
Sure.
I mean, it sort of arises from Stephen's question, and it's the role that the restoration of lands plays in the environmental work in the SABE, and I don't know the answer, and I'm wondering, Mark, if you could sort of address what we mean by land restoration, and perhaps what Stephen's getting to is sort of the reforestation of low constraint lands. I don't know whether that falls into that, but what are we talking about when we talk about land restoration?
Yeah, land restoration and enhancement in Greenland's natural heritage system planning is looking at the overall function and quality of the natural heritage system. A good natural heritage system is linked and connected, has large areas that provide interior habitat. And often in agricultural landscapes, the system is currently fragmented. When we plan new urban expansions, there's opportunity to improve the linkages between and among features and areas, and also to enhance, make bigger features and areas. And that's done typically on what's currently agricultural lands. That's what we mean by enhancement. And that could include reforesting adjacent to existing wetlands and woodlands. And that is part of the exercise. That is an expectation of our studies. We're going to be looking at how best to knit together a natural heritage system that will function ecologically in an urban context. So that is definitely going to be part of the study, and looking at low constraint areas is an opportunity to look at them in synergy with other types of adjacent medium and higher constraint features in the system to look for those opportunities where enhancement of the system would have possible co-benefits for groundwater quality improvements as well. So yeah, we'll be looking at low constraint to help inform the design of the natural heritage system. And there's a variety of technical experts in the study team that can help advise on that. Groundwater experts, surface water, terrestrial ecologists, they use their study best practices to make those recommendations. So hopefully that's covered it, Stefan. Enhancement.
No, that's great.
And
thank you, Mark.
yeah.
Thanks, Mark. We have a follow-up question from Jen. I believe she might have two, might be one follow-up question in two parts, asking whether the natural heritage areas, if they're included in the settlement area boundary expansion, would, however, policies at the local level through the development application process possibly put restrictions on the development, or would it be imposed at that time? So to clarify, she's saying high constraint areas may not necessarily be automatically excluded from the settlement boundary expansion, but policies at the local level may help navigate development close to those areas. That seems fairly clear, and I'll pass that to Adrian for a response.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Jen. So, yeah, the growth management work that Stefan referred to is going to determine the amount of area that's going to be required for settlement boundary expansion, and we'll use that to kind of identify the amount of developable area. But it could very well be that the actual boundaries that we draw for settlement expansion do include some of the green, the kind of the high constraint environmental elements within the actual boundary. However, both the regional and local policies would provide a framework that ensure that the proper protections and management occur on those lands. So the Greenland system policies and mapping that the region provides, and then the local watershed planning and secondary planning, environmental impact studies, and all that would apply for any development near and around those lands. So yeah, it is possible, but that policy framework would be in place to ensure that they're actually not developed upon, and the proper protections and management and enhancements that would occur when the lands are actually developed.
Yeah, and if I can jump in, Andrew, just to add to that, hopefully this clarifies. So what we're going to be identifying and considering at this regional study scale is what we identify as a conceptual natural heritage system. So definitely there's a local study process that will have to happen in subsequent planning stages to deal with more detailed refinement of that system, guided by subwatershed studies, and that would also replicate at a more detailed level a natural heritage system planning exercise, and then even at that stage, when the town plans out a secondary plan for these settlement expansions and puts in place the planning framework for that, there's generally reasonably well established limits of development at that stage, and sometimes, depending on the scale of the secondary plan, informed by field staking exercises. And if that doesn't occur, then there's subsequent approval stages where you're really down to the site level to ensure that we're identifying those boundaries correctly in the development approval. So yeah, definitely there's more detail in subsequent stages where you're dealing with specific boundaries, if that was your question.
Thanks, Mark. Just to let everyone know, if you do happen to think of a question or comment after the fact, there is a way for you to send those comments to the region so that we can respond. Tracy has entered that in the chat, and there's a link there where you can click and enter a written comment. but we still do have a few minutes left, and we'd be happy to take any additional comments or questions that you may have. Again, anything on what you've heard tonight, a question or comment on the SABE expansion study itself, local knowledge you may have, outcomes of the draft technical studies, whatever you'd like to ask. We can certainly wait another few minutes, make sure we capture all of your comments. That may be it for this evening. What I can do is start to give some closing remarks, but if you do think of anything, feel free to add it. We can, of course, address it. So very much importantly, we'd like to thank you all for participating in today's meeting. I thought we had some very interesting questions, and those hopefully will make their way into any revisions that we have. More information about the Peel 2041 Plus and SABE processes is available on the region's website, and you can see the link at the bottom of the slide. The slide deck from tonight's presentation will also be available on the region's website following the meeting, as will a recording of the presentation. A reminder of our next steps. We will be holding additional public consultation meeting tomorrow night, our final of 4 consultation sessions, and tomorrow is on resources, which will include a look at the mineral aggregate study, cultural heritage study, and archaeological impact assessment. If you have any additional questions, you can click the link that's included in the chat, or you can comment to Tara or Catherine. There's a link on the screen right now. I do see we have an additional question, which I will get to in a moment. It's a question from Stephen. I haven't read it yet, so I'll try to do it right off the top. If the region is expected or required to develop urban intensification, why would any more lands be zoned to include suburban settlement expansions? Whatever undeveloped lands that exist presently should be protected to promote self-sufficiency, i.e. food production, high-rise, hydroponic food production, and energy production. And I'm not sure who's best to answer that one. Perhaps Adrian?
I'll start, and others may want to add in. So I think you know, one of the things to think about here is you know, as has been mentioned, we are looking at a long-term plan out to the year 2051. And we do know that you know, the province is going to grow, the GTA is going to grow, and we have been basically required by the province to accommodate our fair share of that growth. And in this case, we're looking at, you know, almost 800,000 additional people that we need to be planning for, and we certainly are in Peel focusing a large proportion of that growth on accommodating that in existing built-up areas, in particular in Mississauga and Brampton. And in fact, in the coming years, almost all of the growth that's going to be happening in Mississauga and Brampton will be through intensification, and that will continue to be, you know, the lion's share of growth across the region. But we also know that that we won't be able to accommodate that entire you know, 800,000 people or so just through intensification. We are going to need some settlement expansion, and you know, and in part that makes sense in terms of what's been provided to us from the province, because if not in Peel and in the areas like Peel, close to the GTA, then it means, you know, beyond and leapfrogging and all of the environmental and social and infrastructure constraints that go with that. But you know, through the work that we're doing here, we are looking at the issues of, you know, density, and in that settlement boundary expansion, and what kinds of things should we be considering, thinking about where and how we plan for that area, and what kind of policies we put in place. So, you know, the points you make are ones that we're mindful of, but also the realities of the fact that there is growth that will need to be planned for in the coming decades in places like Peel. don't know if
Thanks very much,
anybody else
Adrian.
wants to add.
Again, happy to wait a few more minutes in case there's any final comments. Anyone else wants to weigh in on that answer? That may be it for this evening. And we again, thank you very much for your participation. Of course, if you do think of something, please feel free to reach out to Tara or Catherine. Contact information is on the screen. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you tomorrow for our final public consultation event on the technical studies, at least at this stage.